Hello all and welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida for this special episode. It's the 100th video I've uploaded to YouTube in a little over 2 years. I've covered aspects of Florida's tourism history from Pensacola east to Amelia Island and from the Georgia border down to Key West. There's still hundreds of stories to tell and I've got a lot of different subjects lined up in the near future. But today I thought I'd try something a little different. My most recent video was on the history of key lime pie, and that got me thinking about how food is not only an important part of Florida's culture and history, a lot of it is unique to the Sunshine State. That's why I decided to explore the kumquat. While it's not a unique Florida variety of citrus like the key lime, it's a fascinating fruit and one that is little understood by most people. Unlike the key lime, it's still raised commercially in the state, and it's something that tourists would have experienced for over 100 years. So in this video, I'll talk about the kumquat, and my friend Katie and I will cook with this unique fruit. The recipes we've chosen are ones that could have been made in Florida 100 or more years ago using ingredients that were commonly available in Florida, even though it was on the frontier as late as 1920. As I mentioned, my most recent video is on key lime pie. That one briefly covered the history of citrus fruit, including 5 heritage varieties and how hybrids were created. The kumquat is one of those heritage varieties, meaning we don't know quite how old it is, though recent evidence shows they developed several million years ago. They're native to southern Asia and have been a popular fruit there for thousands of years. Eventually, they would be taken west to North Africa and southern Europe, but they appear to have arrived there hundreds of years after the majority of citrus varieties. Because of this late arrival in Europe, possibly as late as the early 1800s, they literally missed the boat when it came to the Spanish and Portuguese conquest of the Americas. Indeed, it's believed that kumquats didn't arrive in Florida until late 1800s from Japan, by way of California. So here's the story of the humble kumquat, and along the way, we'll explore a bit of Florida cracker cooking. Hopefully you'll find it all interesting enough to find some kumquats, pop one in your mouth, and maybe even cook a few. Enjoy. So what exactly is a kumquat? Well, most people consider it a variety of citrus. Indeed, it's often considered one of the 5 heritage varieties, as you can see here. The problem is that some botanists consider it related to citrus, but not actually in the genus. Citrus taxonomy, the classification of the various species, varieties, and cultivars, is complicated and surprisingly controversial. When it relates to kumquats, different schools of thought list the varieties with as many as 6 different species, or unite them into as few as 2. I'm not a biologist, and going in depth on this subject is beyond the scope of my work, so I'll just say that the kumquat may or may not be in the genus Citrus, which contains the orange, grapefruit, lime, and lemon. But if it's not in that genus, it's in a closely related one called Fortunella, which only contains kumquats. Hopefully this chart will help you to understand that taxonomy. I'll also provide a link to a scientific paper I've used. That paper, published in 2022, describes the unique attributes of the kumquat by saying that it's widely processed into candied peel and jam, as well as added to beverage, tea, and cocktail as a natural flavor. It inherently possesses multiple positive economic traits among citrus, such as small-sized tree, cold and dry tolerance, ripening faster, and disease resistance. It goes on to propose a new hypothesis about the evolution of the kumquat. It asserts that fossil records show that it split from the citrus lineage 5 to 6 million years ago and evolved into an independent lineage widely distributed in central and southern China. This Fortunella genus comprises of 2 main populations corresponding to cultivated kumquats and the wild Hong Kong kumquat. A few individuals of the northern kumquat population were selected and cultivated, and thus survive until the present. However, the southern population underwent continuous natural selection to the present day. Despite this paper, there's little consensus about the kumquat's relationship with citrus. They're certainly similar, but have one obvious and significant difference. Kumquats lack the white, bitter pith that citrus fruit has. That area, directly below the rind and oil sacs, is also known as the albedo, which is Latin for whiteness. The spongy citrus pith is generally considered inedible because of its unpleasant bitterness, but the kumquat lacks this pith and thus the harsh flavor. This means that kumquats don't need to be peeled in order to be eaten. They are conveniently small, usually about the same size as olives or grapes. By the way, Katie loves kumquats, but oddly enough doesn't care for either grapes or olives. Like most citrus, kumquats have seeds, but they're small enough that most people just eat the entire fruit, rind, seeds, and all. Try doing that with a Valencia orange. There are 4 varieties of kumquat. The previously mentioned wild Hong Kong type, which isn't typically eaten as they are tiny, bitter, and very seedy. The marumi, which is round and has a sweet peel with a very sour center. They're mostly used to make marmalade. The nagami, an oval-shaped fruit that also has a sweet skin and sour center. They're commonly eaten whole, producing a sweet, tart flavor. The meiwa is a hybrid of the nagami and marumi. It's oval and is fairly sweet all the way through. It's also eaten whole. We refer to the 3 cultivated varieties by their Japanese names since all 3 initially came to the U.S. from Japan. It's hard to label the kumquat as a tree considering its diminutive size and the fact that there's plenty of Florida bushes that grow much larger. Still, like citrus trees, they have woody branches, though without thorns and glossy leaves. Their small white flowers are similar to those of oranges and key limes. The plants can grow up to 8 feet or 2.5 meters tall and 6 feet or 2 meters wide. The fruit resembles tiny oranges. Indeed, the name kumquat comes from the Cantonese name, which literally means golden mandarin orange. Kumquats are self-pollinating and can tolerate both cold and hot temperatures, making them generally safe to grow further north in Florida than most other citrus. A mature plant can produce hundreds of fruits each season, which lasts between December and February. That's when Katie and I went out to pick our own in this small grove. We decided to try 3 recipes with our fresh-picked kumquats: candied kumquats, kumquat chutney, and a Florida-style chicken kumquat purlieu. They all turned out pretty well. The first was a popular way to preserve fruit in Florida over 100 years ago. Kumquats are just one of the many fruits that are candied. The list includes cherries, pineapple, pears, peaches, melon, and ginger root, as well as orange, lemon, and citron peels. When making candied kumquats, you end up replacing most of the water in them with sugar syrup. This will preserve them for weeks in the fridge, and you can even can them like marmalade if you wish. For this recipe, we mostly quartered the kumquats, though Katie pointed out that the result would look nicer if the kumquats were sliced into rounds, so that's what I put in the recipe. While chopping the kumquats, combine sugar, water, honey, and vanilla in a saucepan that will fit the kumquats. It may seem like you're adding a lot of vanilla. I initially did, but it works really well with the honey and kumquats. Of course, you can use actual vanilla bean, but 100 years ago, extract would have been more easily bought in rural Florida. Also, I'd suggest using a light honey rather than a dark one. Bring the mixture to a boil and then add your kumquats. Make sure the fruit is covered with the liquid and then take the mixture back up to a simmer and cook for a couple minutes. Turn off the heat, cover the pan, and let it sit for 15 minutes. Next, strain off the liquid, putting the kumquats in a bowl and the liquid back in the pan to simmer. Stir frequently and let it bubble for 10 minutes or until the liquid reduces to a syrup consistency. Pour it over your kumquats and let it sit until cool. Put them in a covered container like a mason jar and put it in the fridge. The candied kumquats are great on ice cream. You can sweeten your tea with the syrup, and you can use them as a glaze on roasted chicken or pork, ham, or even root vegetables. Lots of options are possible. Use it on waffles and pancakes, puree it, and put it in a smoothie or even an adult beverage. Now on to the kumquat chutney. It may seem odd considering I said I wanted to present more traditional recipes that Floridians made over 100 years ago, but chutneys, even though they are originally from the Indian subcontinent, were known in Florida before 1900. The most common type made in Florida was mango chutney, itself another fruit originally from southern Asia that made its way to Florida sometime in the 19th century, if not before. Indeed, mangoes could have first arrived here during the British control of Florida between 1763 and 1783. It was at this time that the British East India Company was exporting everything it could out of India. For instance, the tea dumped overboard during the 1773 Boston Tea Party was from India. Regardless, mangoes, Indian spices, and even chutneys had made their way to Florida around the same time as kumquats, if not earlier. I've swapped kumquats for mangoes in this old recipe, but I've stuck to the traditional spices, veggies, and even pineapple juice. If you've seen my key lime pie video, you'll remember that pineapple was an early commercial crop in Florida as well. Slice your kumquats like the first recipe. While you're doing that, heat up a large pan, add the oil, jalapeno, and onion, and sweat until they're soft. Add the ginger and pepper and cook for a couple minutes. Finally, add the kumquats. In a separate bowl, combine pineapple juice, vinegar, sugar, and spices. We've used a coffee grinder to take care of the spices, but you could use a mortar and pestle like they would have had. Now, a lot of people have this idea that folks in the 19th century didn't have access to exotic spices, or if they were around, they were way too expensive for the average family. But places like Florida, even in the interior, were not so far away from civilization as it were. St. Augustine had been a port since the 1500s, and after the U.S. took possession of the peninsula, supplies would arrive regularly by steamship from busy ports such as Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina. As for the expensive spices, they're still expensive today, and like us, early Floridian settlers would have used them sparingly. Yes, the truly poor couldn't afford them, but many people could. Chutney would have been one of the better uses for them, as they could spice up the fruit and vegetable preserves that would be made after a bountiful harvest. So add the liquid to the pan, stir to combine. Bring the mixture to a bare simmer and reduce it for about 30 minutes, stirring frequently. Add raisins if you want. Once again, pour the results in a covered container and put in the fridge. Obviously, chutneys can also be preserved long-term by canning. The final recipe also has a strong Indian connection, and with or without kumquats, it's one that I've been cooking for many years, partly because it's really tasty and partly because it's done in one pot and therefore easy to make. I call it chicken and kumquat purlieu. You might never have heard of the word purlieu, and considering that this is how you spell it versus pronounce it, it may just be a bit confusing. A purlieu is a rice dish whose recipe involves cooking in water or stock, adding spices, vegetables, and meat. Like chutney, it originates in India and has spread out from there. A more familiar word for it is pilaf, and it's related to dishes such as paella, arroz con pollo, and even jambalaya. Purlieu appears to be the British spelling of pilaf, which may mean it too got to Florida through the British rather than the Spanish or Americans. The British pronunciation is more like palau. However, I learned to pronounce it purlieu here in Florida many years ago. Anyway, on to the recipe. This one requires a large skillet and one with a cover. An early version called for salt pork, but to me bacon is better, partly because it's smoked as well as salt cured, it's less fatty than salt pork, and also because you can crumble it up and put it on the top of the finished dish. Fry up the bacon until it's crispy and set it aside. Drop in the onion, pepper, and spices and sauté for about 5 minutes or until tender. At this point is where I put in the rice, though not everyone does. I like coating it with the hot fats and spices, which I think gives a better flavor overall. Other cooks put it in after the chicken stock. The rice gets stirred into the pan for a couple minutes. I then add the palm hearts, kumquats, stock, and pre-cooked chicken. If you're not familiar with palm hearts, they were popular in early Florida as a local vegetable that could be eaten fresh or preserved. Harvested from various types of sable palm, native throughout Florida, indigenous people ate it both raw and cooked long before Europeans found the New World. If you've never had them, they're great fresh, but are more easily found in cans in grocery stores. They're high in fiber, have a mild flavor, and even when cooked, they stay firm. The sable palm is Florida's official state tree, so I'll eventually make a video about it for my series on the state symbols. When the mixture comes to a boil, reduce the heat to a simmer and cover it. It should cook for at least 20 minutes so that the rice is tender. I use basmati rice, as long grain rice is best for this type of recipe since it stays light and separate. After that 20 minutes, I take off the lid and check to see the consistency. Some people like their purlieu wet, but I like mine on the dry side. If at this point it's still wet, I'll keep cooking a bit with the lid off to remove the excess water. When you feel it's right, take it off the heat, top it with the chopped bacon, and you're done. The kumquats aren't really that important to the recipe, but they do retain their flavor, and it shows a typical way people would have used them when faced with hundreds of ripe fruit on each tree. By the way, there's any number of purlieu recipes. There's no rules other than the use of rice and the method of cooking. It's good to add some sort of acid to the recipe, and I often put tomatoes in mine. Chicken is very common, but purlieu works really well with leftover turkey, and of course early Floridians would have used squirrel meat as well. Yeah, that's weird today, but considering how many squirrels we have in Florida, it's hardly surprising. The kumquat is a fascinating fruit, so much like a tiny orange, but still different. In 2023, it's hard to believe that the nature of citrus could still be up for debate among botanists. But that's one of the reasons why I find citrus such an interesting subject. I hope this video will encourage you to try kumquats, either eating them as they are or cooking with them. They're unique, flavorful, and fun. They're good for you, and it'd be wonderful if they became a more popular Florida delicacy. Thank you once again for watching another of my videos. If you learned something, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to learn more about Florida's tourism history. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.